The house was quiet in the way only Christmas Eve night can be, a silence shaped by expectation rather than absence, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath until morning. The tree stood in the corner of the living room, lights glowing softly, casting long shadows across wrapped presents arranged with care beneath its branches. Every gift had been placed there with intention, each tag bearing a name, each ribbon tied with a purpose. No one expected that one small box, tucked slightly behind the others, would change the course of a murder investigation that had already gone cold. The family had tried to keep the holiday intact despite the tragedy that hovered over them. 3 months earlier, a man had been found dead in his office, the victim of a violent crime that left more questions than answers. He was a husband, a father, and a business owner, respected in his community with no obvious enemies and no clear motive for his death. The police investigation had moved quickly at first, combing through financial records, interviewing co-workers, questioning acquaintances. Then, gradually, it slowed. Leads dried up, suspects were cleared, the case settled into that uncomfortable space between active and forgotten. Christmas was supposed to be a pause, a chance for the family to focus on something other than loss. The children still believed in traditions. Stockings were hung, cookies were left out. The tree was decorated the same way it always had been, with ornaments collected over years, each one carrying a memory that now felt heavier than before. The widow insisted on keeping everything as normal as possible. She believed that if they followed the ritual closely enough, the pain might soften, even briefly. Late that night, after the children had gone to bed and the house lights were dimmed, she sat alone in the living room, staring at the tree. Her attention drifted to the presents below it, counting them out of habit. That was when she noticed it. One gift she didn't remember buying. It was small, neatly wrapped in plain brown paper, no bright holiday design, no decorative flair. The ribbon was simple. The tag bore her husband's handwriting. Her first thought was that grief was playing tricks on her, that the familiarity of the writing was imagined, a projection born from longing. But as she leaned closer, the details sharpened. The slant of the letters, the way he crossed his T, the slight pressure marks from the pen. It was unmistakable. The tag read only one word: "For you." She sat there for a long time, the room illuminated by the soft glow of the tree lights, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the distant sound of a car passing outside. The gift felt out of place, not because it didn't belong under the tree, but because it shouldn't have been there at all. Her husband had been gone for months. There was no opportunity for him to place it there, at least none that made sense. She considered leaving it untouched, waiting until morning, preserving the moment for the children. But something about the weight of the box, the way it seemed deliberately hidden behind larger gifts, made her uneasy. This wasn't a last-minute surprise or a forgotten package. It felt intentional, as if it had been positioned to avoid immediate notice. When she finally picked it up, she noticed how heavy it was for its size. Not large enough to be anything obvious, not light enough to be empty. She shook it gently. There was no sound inside, no shifting, no rattle. Whatever it contained was packed tightly, deliberately secured. She didn't open it that night. Instead, she placed it on the couch table and sat across from it, studying the paper, the ribbon, the handwriting. Questions formed faster than answers. How did it get there? When? Who placed it? Why now? The next morning, Christmas Day began the way it always had. Children woke early, laughter filled the house. For a few hours, the world narrowed to wrapping paper and smiles and carefully practiced joy. The mysterious gift stayed beneath the tree, unnoticed among the excitement, still hidden behind brighter packages. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when the house quieted again and relatives had left, that she brought it out. She placed it on the dining table this time, away from the holiday setting, as if removing it from the tree made it easier to face whatever it contained. She opened it slowly, peeling back the paper with care rather than tearing it away. Inside was a smaller box, unmarked, sealed with clear tape. Beneath that, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a flash drive and a folded envelope. The envelope held a short note written in the same familiar handwriting. "If something happens to me, this matters." Her hands trembled as she read it again and again. She didn't plug in the flash drive herself. Instead, she called the detective who had handled her husband's case, the same one who had called months earlier to explain there were no new developments. When he arrived, the house was still up. The house still smelled faintly of pine and baked sweets, a setting that felt entirely wrong for what was about to unfold. The data on that flash drive would reopen the investigation, shift suspicion, and expose a truth no one had considered. A gift placed under a tree had preserved evidence that time and fear nearly erased. And before the night was over, detectives would realize that the murderer had been closer than anyone imagined, hiding in plain sight, trusting that Christmas would keep secrets buried. The gift under the tree had done what months of interviews could not. It spoke for the dead, and it was only the beginning. The detective arrived just after sunset, long after the last Christmas visitor had gone home and the house had returned to a quieter, heavier version of itself. Outside, the neighborhood still glowed with holiday lights, strings of red and white tracing rooftops and hedges, creating the illusion that nothing here had changed. Inside, the dining table had been cleared of plates and wrapping paper, replaced by a single object placed carefully at the center. The small box no longer looked like a gift, it looked like evidence. The detective did not rush. Years on the job had taught him that moments like this required patience. He listened as the widow explained how she found the package, how she recognized the handwriting, how the note made her feel as though her husband had planned this long before his death. He asked precise questions, not about emotions, but about details. When exactly she noticed the gift, who had been in the house in the weeks leading up to Christmas, whether anyone else had access to the living room, whether the children had noticed anything unusual. The answers complicated things immediately. Several relatives had visited, friends had stopped by with food, neighbors had dropped off cards. The house had not been sealed off from the world. If someone placed the gift there, it could have been anyone with access at any time. And yet, the handwriting suggested something more deliberate, something personal. When the detective finally examined the contents, he put on gloves, treating the flash drive as if it had been pulled from a crime scene rather than a Christmas box. He photographed everything: the paper, the ribbon, the envelope, even the way the cloth had been folded around the drive. Nothing was discarded, nothing was assumed to be meaningless. They moved into the home office, the same room where the victim had spent countless evenings working late, a space still frozen in time. Papers sat neatly stacked, a calendar hung open to a date 3 months earlier. The chair remained slightly pulled back from the desk, as if he might return at any moment. The detective plugged the flash drive into a department-issued laptop, careful not to use any personal devices. The files loaded slowly. At first glance, there was nothing dramatic. No videos, no recordings, just folders carefully labeled with dates and short descriptions, financial summaries, email backups, scanned documents. It looked like routine data, the kind a business owner might keep for reference. But as the detective opened the files one by one, patterns began to emerge. There were discrepancies, small at first, invoices that didn't match payments, emails that referenced meetings that never appeared on calendars, contracts with signatures that didn't quite align. Nothing illegal on its own, but enough to suggest someone had been manipulating records quietly, consistently over time. Then there was a folder labeled simply "Deck." Inside were screenshots of text messages exchanged late at night, conversations saved deliberately rather than automatically backed up. The messages were tense, confrontational, filled with accusations and veiled threats. Names were abbreviated, context was missing, but one thing was clear: the victim had been afraid. The detective leaned back in his chair, the glow of the laptop reflecting off the glass of framed family photos on the wall. This wasn't random data, it was curated, selected, preserved with intention. The victim knew something was wrong, and instead of confronting it openly, he had prepared. The widow watched from across the room, arms crossed tightly, reading the detective's expression rather than the screen. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "Did he ever mention feeling unsafe?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. She admitted that in the weeks before his death, her husband had been distracted, guarded. He had changed passwords, taken phone calls outside. Once, she recalled, he had said something that felt strange at the time, that if anything ever happened to him, she should trust that he had left answers somewhere. At the time, she assumed it was stress. The files continued. Audio recordings followed, short clips recorded on a phone, conversations captured without the other party's knowledge. Voices were muffled, background noise suggested cars, offices, hallways, but the tone was unmistakable. Pressure, manipulation, an argument that never resolved. One voice appeared repeatedly, calm, controlled, familiar. The detective paused the recording and asked a question that shifted the room. "Do you recognize that voice?" She did, immediately, and the recognition drained the color from her face. It belonged to someone who attended the funeral, someone who had offered condolences, someone who had been considered a friend. The implication was devastating. If the data was genuine, if the recordings were authentic, then the murder was not the result of a random act or an unknown intruder. It was personal, calculated, and likely motivated by fear of exposure. The detective closed the laptop and made a call to the department. The case was officially reopened. What had been dormant was now active again, fueled by evidence that had waited patiently under a Christmas tree. But the gift raised as many questions as it answered. How had the victim known this would be necessary? Why hadn't he shared this information earlier? And most importantly, how had the box ended up in the house after his death? The detective returned to that question repeatedly. Someone had placed it there. That meant the timeline extended beyond the murder itself. Either the victim had hidden the gift somewhere and instructed someone to deliver it later, or the person responsible for placing it there knew exactly where to find it. That realization shifted suspicion in an unexpected direction. They revisited the original case file, the timeline of the murder, the people who had access to the victim's office, the individuals who had keys, codes, familiarity. A new detail emerged that hadn't seemed important before. In the days after the murder, one person had returned personal items to the family: files, books, office supplies, items retrieved from the victim's workspace and delivered in a box labeled belongings. That person had been trusted. Now that trust felt fragile. The detective began reconstructing the days following the murder minute by minute. Who entered the office, who packed the boxes, who transported them, who had unsupervised time with the victim's things. The list narrowed quickly. Christmas Eve was no longer just a date on the calendar. It was now a deadline, a moment chosen deliberately. Someone wanted the gift discovered when emotions were high, when the house would be full, when suspicion would be diffused by celebration. Or someone believed that Christmas would protect them, that no one would question a gift under a tree. As the evening stretched on, the detective secured the flash drive and copies of the files, sealing them as evidence. He advised the widow to say nothing to anyone, not family, not friends, especially not the person's voice appeared on the recordings. Silence, he explained, was now part of the investigation. When he left, the house felt colder. The decorations no longer felt comforting. The tree lights cast shadows that seemed sharper, more defined. A space once filled with tradition had become part of a crime scene again, not officially marked, but emotionally transformed. Upstairs, the children slept, unaware that the holiday had reopened a wound rather than healed it. Downstairs, the gift box sat empty on the table, its purpose fulfilled, its presence no longer needed. The victim had found a way to speak after death, but in doing so, he had set something else in motion, a chain of events that would expose betrayal, dismantle relationships, and force a community to confront the truth hidden behind familiar faces. The murder was no longer unsolved. It was waiting to be confronted. The investigation moved quietly at first, the way delicate things always do. There were no flashing lights outside the house, no uniforms knocking on doors, no public announcements that the case had been reopened. The detective understood that whoever placed the gift under the tree believed themselves to be safe, protected by familiarity and timing. Drawing attention too early would only send that person into hiding. Instead, the work began with paper. Every file from the flash drive was duplicated, authenticated, and cross-checked. Digital forensics confirmed what the widow already knew in her bones. The handwriting on the tag matched her husband's. The note was genuine. The files had been compiled over several weeks, not all at once, suggesting a slow realization rather than a sudden panic. This was not the act of someone who feared an immediate threat. It was the preparation of someone who suspected betrayal. The detective focused on the recordings. Audio technicians enhanced them carefully, isolating voices, reducing background noise, pulling clarity from conversations never meant to be preserved. With each pass, the repeated voice became unmistakable, calm, confident, controlled. A voice that never raised itself, even when the other speakers sounded agitated. That voice belonged to a man named Daniel Mercer. Daniel had been the victim's business partner for over a decade. They had built the company together from a small operation into something substantial, something valuable. To outsiders, they were inseparable, the kind of partnership people admired. Daniel spoke at the funeral. He comforted the widow. He told stories about shared struggles and success. No one questioned his grief. No one except the man who was now dead. The financial files told a story Daniel had never intended to share. Small transfers routed through shell accounts, expenses disguised as operational costs, contracts amended quietly. It wasn't theft in the obvious sense. It was erosion, a slow siphoning of control and money designed to go unnoticed for years. The victim had noticed. The messages revealed confrontation but not resolution. Late-night texts asking for explanations, requests for meetings that were postponed repeatedly, a tone that shifted from curiosity to concern, then to something closer to fear. One recording captured the moment the victim realized the scale of what was happening. His voice shook, not with anger but with disbelief. Daniel's response was measured, almost soothing. He denied nothing outright. He reframed, he minimized, he suggested misunderstandings and timing issues. He spoke the language of someone who believed himself smarter than the situation. The detective listened to that recording twice, then a third time. He wasn't listening for words anymore. He was listening for confidence, for the absence of urgency, for the quiet certainty of someone who believed consequences could always be delayed. That certainty had likely been broken only once, when the victim started documenting. Investigators reconstructed the weeks leading up to the murder with renewed precision. The victim had scheduled meetings with attorneys. He had requested financial audits. He had contacted an outside consultant. Each action increased pressure. Each step narrowed Daniel's options. And then, abruptly, the victim was dead. Officially, the cause of death had been ruled a homicide with no signs of forced entry. The initial assumption had been that the victim knew his attacker. That assumption had gone nowhere at the time. Now it pointed directly at someone everyone trusted. But suspicion alone was not enough. The detective needed to place Daniel in the timeline, to show opportunity, to prove access, to connect motive with action. Daniel's alibi for the night of the murder seemed solid months earlier. He claimed to have been at home, alone, working late. No witnesses, but no contradictions either. At the time, investigators had no reason to press further. Now that same alibi looked fragile. Phone records showed activity gaps inconsistent with his stated timeline. Security footage from a nearby parking structure captured a vehicle matching his car entering late that night. The footage was grainy, the license plate unreadable, but the timing aligned too closely to ignore. Then there was the matter of the gift. Someone had placed it under the tree weeks after the murder. That act required access to the house, knowledge of routines, and confidence that it wouldn't be questioned. Daniel had visited the house multiple times after the death, offering support, delivering paperwork, checking in. His presence felt natural, comforting even. The detective returned to the widow's memory of those visits. She recalled one in particular, a few days before Christmas. Daniel had arrived unannounced, carrying a box of documents from the office. He insisted on placing it himself in the spare room, saying it would be easier to go through later. She had thanked him. She had trusted him. That box had been moved. The detective didn't accuse. He didn't confront. He waited. Surveillance was authorized quietly. Daniel's movements were tracked, his communications monitored. The investigation needed patience. Rushing would only give him time to adjust. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on the family deepened. The widow struggled with conflicting realities. The man she had trusted was now the focus of a murder investigation. Every memory of his kindness felt contaminated, every gesture reinterpreted. Christmas decorations were taken down early. The tree, once the center of warmth, now felt like a reminder of how easily something meaningful could be manipulated. As days passed, Daniel began to sense a shift, not from police contact, but from silence. Calls returned more slowly, emails unanswered, meetings postponed, the subtle signs of attention turning inward. He responded by becoming more visible, more helpful. He reached out to the widow again, offering assistance with financial matters. He suggested meeting in person. She declined, following the detective's instructions. The refusal unsettled him. Investigators noticed a change in his behavior. He drove longer routes. He checked mirrors more frequently. He made calls from parked locations instead of his office. These weren't the actions of an innocent man, but they also weren't proof of guilt. The breakthrough came from something small. An overlooked access log from the victim's office building showed a late-night entry the evening after the murder. The card used belonged to Daniel. He claimed he was retrieving personal items to deliver to the family. At the time, no one questioned it. But now, investigators compared the timestamp with security footage. Daniel entered alone. He stayed for nearly an hour, longer than necessary for gathering belongings, longer than expected for someone grieving. What he did during that hour mattered. Forensic analysts returned to the office space. Although months had passed, subtle traces remained. A desk drawer had been wiped down more thoroughly than others. A filing cabinet showed signs of having been recently opened and closed, despite claims that it hadn't been accessed. The conclusion became unavoidable. Daniel had returned to the office not just to retrieve items, but to remove something he believed would never be found. He hadn't known about the flash drive. He hadn't known about the gift. The victim had outplanned him. The detective finally felt the weight of certainty settle. Not proof, not yet, but clarity. The kind that narrows focus and sharpens resolve. The kind that turns a story from tragedy to accountability. Christmas had delayed justice, but it hadn't prevented it. The gift under the tree had done more than reopen a case. It had exposed the quiet arrogance of someone who believed timing and trust would protect him forever. Now the walls were closing in, and Daniel Mercer was beginning to realize that the silence he relied on was breaking. Once suspicion hardens into direction, investigations change shape. The questions become sharper. The margins for coincidence disappear. What had once been a wide field of possibilities narrowed until nearly everything pointed back to the same familiar figure, moving calmly through the center of the story as if he belonged there. Daniel Mercer was invited in for what was described as a routine follow-up interview. The phrasing was intentional. No accusations, no urgency, just another conversation, framed as clarification. He arrived dressed the same way he always did, neutral colors, professional posture, the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being trusted. He brought coffee for the detective, a small gesture meant to reassert familiarity. It did not work. The interview room was quiet, undecorated, deliberately impersonal. No windows, no holiday reminders, just a table, 2 chairs, and a recorder placed where Daniel could see it. The detective began with neutral ground, business history, partnership timelines, the early years of the company. Daniel spoke smoothly, confidently, recounting shared struggles and successes with ease. He smiled at the right moments. He paused thoughtfully when expected. Then the questions shifted. The detective asked about December, about late-night meetings, about disagreements that never made it into official records. Daniel's posture adjusted slightly, a subtle tightening of the shoulders. His answers grew longer, more explanatory. He spoke about stress, about misunderstandings, about how the victim had been under a lot of pressure. The detective listened without interruption. When asked directly about financial discrepancies, Daniel didn't deny them. He reframed them, described them as accounting delays, cash flow issues, technicalities that would have resolved themselves given time. His tone suggested patience rather than defensiveness, as if the real problem was the investigation's lack of understanding. Then came the silence. The detective placed a transcript on the table, not the audio itself, just words, lines of dialogue printed cleanly on white paper. He slid it across slowly, giving Daniel time to read the header. Daniel recognized the conversation immediately. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed. His expression shifted, not to panic, but to calculation. He looked up once, meeting the detective's gaze briefly, then returned to the page. The detective said nothing. Silence is not empty in interrogation rooms. It is pressure without shape. It forces people to decide whether to fill it or endure it. Daniel chose to fill it. He laughed softly, shaking his head. He said the recording was taken out of context, that private conversations between partners often sound worse than they are, that the victim had been emotional, paranoid even. He suggested stress had distorted perceptions. The detective let him speak. Then he placed a second document on the table, a timeline, dates, times, locations, phone activity logs, access records, security footage stills. Each item harmless on its own. Together, they told a story Daniel had not rehearsed. The timeline showed his access card used at the office after the murder, the length of time spent inside, the discrepancy between his stated movements and digital records, the gap in phone activity that aligned precisely with the estimated time of death. Daniel leaned back in his chair. For the first time, he stopped trying to explain. What followed was not a confession, but something more revealing, a shift from performance to self-preservation. He asked what evidence they had, how certain they were, what exactly could be proven. These were not the questions of an innocent man seeking clarity. They were the calculations of someone measuring risk. The detective answered carefully. He spoke of ongoing analysis, of corroboration still underway, of the importance of understanding motives and decisions. He did not mention the gift, not yet. Daniel left the interview without charges. That too was intentional. Arresting him prematurely would have locked the investigation into a narrow frame. Instead, investigators wanted movement, reaction, mistakes. They did not wait long. Within days, Daniel began altering his behavior. He contacted an attorney. He stopped returning calls. He transferred assets quietly. He attempted to retrieve items from storage units connected to the business. Each action was documented. Then came the mistake. Late one night, Daniel accessed a cloud account tied to the company, attempting to delete archived correspondence he believed no longer existed. What he didn't know was that investigators were already monitoring activity. The deletion attempt triggered alerts. Backup logs preserved everything. Among the files he tried to erase was a draft email never sent, written by the victim, addressed to an external auditor. The subject line was simple: urgent. The email laid out concerns clearly. It referenced documentation, it mentioned fear, and it stated plainly that if anything happened to him, Daniel Mercer should be investigated. That email changed the case. The district attorney approved warrants. Financial crimes units joined the investigation. The murder was no longer isolated. It was connected to fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy. The narrative widened, closing off escape routes Daniel hadn't realized he needed. When police returned to Daniel's home with a warrant, it was early morning. Not Christmas this time. No decorations, no softness, just procedure. His arrest was quiet. No resistance, no spectacle. Neighbors watched from windows, curiosity replacing celebration. During the search, investigators found something unexpected. In a locked drawer in Daniel's home office, they discovered an envelope. Inside were printed screenshots of messages, copies of financial summaries, and a handwritten note. The note read, "In case he left something behind." Daniel suspected the victim might have prepared evidence. He had searched for it. He believed he had destroyed it. He believed himself thorough. He had been wrong. The revelation reframed the gift under the tree. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't delivered by chance. The victim had anticipated Daniel's actions. He had known Daniel would return to the office, that he would remove documents, that he would believe the problem solved. The gift had been hidden elsewhere, somewhere Daniel never thought to look, somewhere deeply personal, and instructions had been left for it to be delivered later, quietly, by someone who believed they were fulfilling a final wish, not exposing a murderer. That person would never be charged. Their role was unknowing, their timing accidental, but their action proved decisive. As Daniel sat in custody, the image he had cultivated collapsed. Business partner, family friend, trusted presence. Each role peeled away, revealing calculation beneath. He had not planned the murder months in advance, but when pressure mounted, when exposure loomed, he had chosen a permanent solution. He believed the night would protect him. He believed trust would shield him. He believed Christmas would blur memory. Instead, it preserved it. The case was no longer about whether Daniel Mercer was responsible. It was about how far his influence reached and whether anyone else had helped him believe he could get away with it. The timeline had collapsed, and with it, the illusion of safety he had relied on. All that remained was the final reckoning and the truth about how a single gift ensured that silence would never be the end of the story. The trial did not begin in winter. By the time opening statements were delivered, Christmas felt distant, almost unreal, as if it belonged to another lifetime. Yet every detail of the case still circled back to that night, to the quiet house, to the tree standing in the corner of a living room, and to a small, unremarkable gift that no one was meant to question. Daniel Mercer sat at the defense table wearing the same controlled expression he had carried for years. He looked smaller there, stripped of authority, stripped of context. The courtroom was filled with people who had once admired him, former employees, business associates, friends who now avoided eye contact. The widow sat several rows back, hands folded, listening without reaction. She had learned that grief did not announce itself loudly anymore. It lived quietly, just beneath the surface. The prosecution built its case slowly, deliberately, not around emotion, but around preparation. They showed how the victim had documented his growing fear, how financial records told a story of manipulation, how recordings captured a dynamic that had shifted from partnership to threat. Each piece alone might have raised suspicion. Together, they revealed intent. But it was the gift that anchored everything. When the flash drive was introduced into evidence, the courtroom grew noticeably still. Jurors leaned forward as the detective described how it was discovered, where it had been placed, and why its timing mattered. Photographs of the gift type were displayed on screens, the handwriting, the single phrase, "For you." The prosecution did not dramatize it. They did not need to. The simplicity carried its own weight. They explained how the victim anticipated his own silence, how he understood that direct confrontation might fail, how he planned for a future where he could no longer speak for himself. The gift was not a message meant for Christmas, it was meant for truth. The defense attempted to challenge the chain of custody. They questioned why the data had not been found sooner. They suggested that grief could distort memory, that handwriting could be misinterpreted, that recordings could lack context. But every attempt to introduce doubt ran into the same problem. The victim had been careful. Digital timestamps aligned, metadata matched known activity, independent experts verified authenticity. There were no gaps large enough to exploit, no missing steps. The gift had preserved evidence exactly as it was intended to be preserved. Daniel's demeanor shifted as the trial progressed, not dramatically, not outwardly, but those watching closely could see it. The calm calculation faded, fatigue replaced confidence, the illusion of control cracked in small ways, a clenched jaw, a delayed response, a glance that lingered too long on the screen displaying his own words. The moment that defined the trial came when the prosecution played one of the audio recordings in full. The courtroom listened to the victim's voice, steady but strained, confronting Daniel quietly, asking for explanations, expressing fear without accusation. Then Daniel's voice followed, calm and reassuring, offering half-answers and deflections. There was no shouting, no threat, just imbalance. The jury did not need theatrics to understand what they were hearing. They recognized the sound of someone cornered without realizing it. They recognized the tone of someone who believed consequences could always be delayed. When Daniel took the stand, his testimony was precise and carefully framed. He spoke of misunderstandings, of stress, of a partnership that had grown complicated. He denied violence. He denied intent. He denied ever believing the victim was in danger. But when questioned about the office access after the murder, his answers grew narrower. When asked about attempts to delete files, he hesitated. When confronted with the envelope found in his home labeled "in case he left something behind," he had no explanation that fit. The gift under the tree hovered over every exchange, unseen but present, like a witness that could not be intimidated. Closing arguments returned to that point. The prosecution reminded the jury that murder does not always announce itself with rage. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as necessity. They argued that the victim did not expect justice to come quickly, only eventually. That was why he waited, why he prepared, why he trusted that truth, once uncovered, would not need his voice. The defense attempted to separate emotion from evidence, but by then the evidence had already done its work. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. Guilty. The word landed without sound. No gasps, no applause, just a collective exhale. Daniel Mercer stared forward, unmoving, as if waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. At sentencing, the judge spoke not of holidays or symbolism, but of betrayal, of how trust was used as a weapon, of how planning a crime included planning for silence. The sentence reflected not just the act itself, but the attempt to erase accountability. When it was over, the widow returned home alone. The house felt different now, lighter perhaps, but emptier in ways that could never be filled. The Christmas decorations were gone, the tree had long since been taken down. The living room no longer carried the weight of unanswered questions. She kept the gift box, not the contents, those were evidence, but the box itself, the paper, the ribbon, the tag. It sat in a drawer, untouched, not as a reminder of violence, but as proof of something else, that preparation can outlast fear, that truth can be patient, that silence does not always mean absence. The gift under the tree did not bring her husband back. It did not restore what was lost, but it ensured that the story ended where it needed to, with the truth spoken, and with the certainty that even in death, he had not been powerless.